Hi, welcome back. Here we are at Module 6. Here we will be discussing leadership processes as well as approaches to leadership. Let's first start with our definitions of leadership. Leadership is imagining, willing, and driving, and thereby making something happen which was not going to happen otherwise. It's also a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. We'll be talking about leadership in our next several slides. Regardless of our definition of leadership, they all embody three significant elements. They're listed here: a behavioral process, interpersonal nature, and the fact that a leader is aimed at influencing and motivating members towards goals. The process of influence is sometimes even synonymous with leadership. That is, what distinguishes leading from other management functions is that the planning, organizing, and evaluating can largely be carried out without significant interaction. However, leadership requires that interpersonal contact between manager and the other portions of the organization. We're going to consider this concept of leadership from three various theoretical approaches. There's the trait approach. That is, it considers the traits of leaders. This approach is less favorable today, and we'll spend less time on it. There's also the behavioral approach. It examines the behaviors of our leaders. And finally, there's our situational approach. This considers our leaders' traits or behaviors in a specific situation or context. Our first theoretical approach is the behavioral approach. It's what leaders actually do to contribute to group performance and satisfaction. Two major research programs, The Ohio State University, and for those of you who don't know, it's my alma mater, hence the red highlight, and that school up north. When you're an Ohio State alum, you always refer to the University of Michigan as indeed that school up north, conducted some studies that examine the behavioral approach. They're highlighted in Chapter 11 of your text. I'll give you some specifics here. Ohio State considered 9 dimensions of leader behavior and then ultimately condensed those dimensions into 2 categories: consideration and initiating structure. What they determined was that successful athletic directors are high on initiating structure and low on consideration. That school up north examined 2 styles of leader behavior: employee orientation and product orientation. Product orientation caused a greater degree of employee resentment, dissatisfaction, turnover, and absenteeism. Our 4 dimensions of leadership behavior are those that can be synthesized from the Ohio State research and the School Up North's research are these kind of dimension of leader behavior and the description. They are detailed here in your slide. Additionally, you can find them in Exhibit 11.3 in your text. Uckel and Associates came up with this specific and mega categories of leadership behaviors. This also falls under our behavioral theories. They determined 12 leadership behaviors and then subcategorized them into these 3. We have finished discussing our behavioral theories of leadership, and now we're going to move on to talk about some of our situational theories of leadership. These theories take into account different contexts and ultimately then leadership situations. We're going to consider members, leaders, and organizations from the following models. We'll look at the contingency model. We'll look at model of managerial motivation. We'll look at the path goal theory. And we'll also look at that adaptive-reactive theory. Those will be coming up in our next slides. Our first model here is our contingency model of leadership effectiveness. This was determined by Fiedler. This model of leadership effectiveness proposes that our leader style, whether task orientation versus employee or interpersonal orientation, is a relatively stable personality characteristic. Furthermore, that second part, situation in which the leader operates may be more or less favorable to that leader. That's that situational favorableness. And finally, leadership effectiveness is contingent upon the fit between that leader's style and the favorableness of the situation. This concept goes along with Fidler's contingency model of leadership effectiveness. Fidler determined this way to assess leadership style. He did it by asking individuals to determine who is the least preferred coworker, or that person they had the most difficulty working with. So, Fidler assessed them by asking them to respond to a number of items depending on how they felt about working with a coworker. So an individual score on this LPC, or least preferred coworker scale, is considered to reflect then that individual's leadership style. So what can we say? The high LPC individual is a person who derives major satisfaction from successful interpersonal relationships, and that low LPC person derives major satisfaction from task performance. Thus, basic motivation of a leader who gives a high LPC rating is primarily toward the development of interpersonal relationships, particularly with subordinates, whereas that basic motivation of a leader who gives a low LPC rating is primary towards task accomplishments. High LPC is about relationships, low LPC is about task accomplishment. One of the components of our contingency model of leadership effectiveness was that situational favorableness. Here are 3 elements of our situational favorableness: leader-member relations, task structure, and power position of the leader. Recall that our situational favorableness reflects the degree to which the situation permits or facilitates the exercise of influence by our leader. Leader-member relations then refer to the degree to which the members like and respect our leader. Task structure. This is where the more structured the task is, the more it contributes to satisfactional favorableness. And finally, position of power of our leader. This notion reflects the authority invested in the leader's position and the degree of control he or she has over rewards and sanctions. Our next situational theory of leadership is our model of managerial motivation. This considers human needs and that they influence behavior and motivation, need for affiliation, need for achievement, and need for power. Please consider our slide here as it gives us a pictorial vision of this model of managerial motivation. You can find this also in Exhibit 11.7. Let's briefly compare our contingency model with our managerial motivation model. Key similarities is that they both emphasize the leader's specific personal traits. The difference is that our contingency model is task-oriented and that the leader is often autocratic. Our managerial motivation is power-motivated managers that can express the power motive in democratic ways. So what are the implications for sport managers with that contingency model of leadership? It's important to know that any leadership style can be effective if it's matched with the situation and its favorableness. It's also easier to change a situation than a leadership style. And finally, this contingency model of leadership theory provides a guideline for aspiring leaders. Choose a leadership position in which situation favorableness matches your leadership style. Our next situational theory of leadership is path-goal theory of leader effectiveness. This focuses on members' personal goals, perceptions of the organizational goals, and the most effective ways to achieve those goals. It ultimately specifies how leadership should clarify members' paths to goals and rewards. Leaders' behaviors are related to these 4 things: instrumental behavior, supportive behavior, participative behavior, and achievement-oriented behavior. Instrumental behavior serves to clarify what members are expected to do. Supportive behavior is where a manager or a leader is concerned with members' welfare as well as a friendly workplace environment. Participative behavior reflects the degree to which a leader shares information with members and allows them to participate in that decision-making process. Achievement-oriented behavior reflects the degree to which the manager sets challenging goals, expects good performance, and expresses confidence in its members. So the path goal theory, in essence, suggests that the extent to which a leader engages these behaviors is a function of the situations the leadership faces. Therefore, situational theory of leadership. Keeping with the situational theory of leadership, path goal theory has two major assertions. Leadership is supplemental. It's most necessary when motivation is lacking in the organization, and that motivational effect of a leader is a function of the situation. Member factors, environmental factors, and the organizational set are all situational occurrences that affect the leader. It's important to note that there are some implications of the path goal theory. This slide recognizes that there are substitutes for leadership, that leadership and/or influence is not needed in every and all situations. Particularly, these are based upon the characteristics of the members. Some groups don't need that supplemental influence. Other individuals are influenced by being connected and affiliated with professional organizations. Some natures of our tasks and our work groups don't need additional leadership or influence. And finally, some of our organizational structures in place don't necessarily need additional leadership concepts as well. I want us to recognize that through this slide. Our last situational theory is the Adaptive-Reactive Theory. Two classes of variables have an impact on leaders and members. It's at the macro and micro variable level. You'll see these at the top and bottom of our diagram. Furthermore, we have two types of leader behavior. We have an adaptive and a reactive. Those we can see acting in the middle. We'll talk a little more about these concepts next. As its name suggests, adaptive and reactive behavior impacts our leadership concept here. Adaptive behavior is the degree to which a leader adapts to the requirements of the organization. It's those macro variables. Remember, we saw that at the top of our visual in the prior slide, acting on our adaptive behaviors. It constrains leader behavior in specific ways. I also want us to recognize there's the reactive side, or the reactive behavior. This is elicited by those micro variables. It's at the bottom portion of our diagram from the prior slide. This is largely under control of the leader. It reflects the leader's discretionary influence. With any discussion of leadership, it's important to talk about sources of power. We can think about power by position or by person. First, positions of power are those that are given by what I like to call title. It's legitimate power. It's the person with the title in charge. People with positions of power or in position also have reward power and or coercive power. Power to reward or power to punish. It's that individual that has the ability to give someone a raise or to demote them. There's also personal powers. These are expert power and referent power. Expert power I like to call the best person on the team. That person has personal power because they're the expert. It may be LeBron James because he is arguably the best person on his team. Then there's also this concept of referent power, the reverence. This stems from admiration that other people have for an individual. Depending on sources of power, these also ultimately have a great impact on leadership. More contemporary approaches to leadership have had criticisms of our leadership theories we discussed. Two ways. It's discussed how leadership theories are constraining in nature as well as transactional in nature. Leaders can only adapt to the situation and react to member preferences. There's also a recognition that transactions may be rewards, punishments, or even threats. In turn, members must comply with leaders' directions and suggestions. The remaining portion of our module is going to address some more contemporary approaches to leadership. We'll consider this transactional versus transformational leader. Our first contemporary approach to leadership is this leader-member exchange theory. It's a transactional theory. It will be denoted going forward by LMX. The implication of this theory is simply that a leader is likely to bestow trust and support upon those individuals the leader values as contributors to positive group environment. The leader is not likely to be interacting as much with those as seen as less valuable to the group. This differential treatment of members is likely to lead to the formation of an in-group and an out-group. We'll see that in just a second. Our diagram here demonstrates this formation of in and out groups that we previously talked about in the prior slide. The leader denotes groups that tend to be more valuable, and those that are less valuable, we will say. More valuable groups are the in group, less valuable groups being the out groups, and there's that transaction here. It's denoted here also in your text in Exhibit 12.2. Again, a more contemporary approach to leadership has seen this transition from a transactional leader to a transformational leader. The transactional leader can be effective for maintaining productivity and effectiveness. And we define that transformational leader here. It's the process of influencing major changes in the attitudes and assumptions of organizational members, ultimately organizational culture. And it builds commitment for major changes in the organization's objectives and strategies. The slide here differentiates between a transactional leader and a transformational leader. It discusses those factors affected by a transactional leader and ultimately the outcomes, as well as the factors affected for the transformational leader and their outcomes. This can be found in Exhibit 12.3 in your text as well. We'll be talking more about the transformational leader. So what is transformational leadership? Bass's 1985 view of this considered a transformational leader to be charismatic as well as intellectually stimulating and having the ability to individually consider each member of the organization. Bennis's view thought about this transformational leadership as a visionary leader or managing attention, meeting, trust, and self. So what makes an effective good leader? Bennis and Biederman have some discussion about this. An effective group leader provides directions for members and signifies the importance of what they do. They also generate trust. They make resolute but sometimes risky decisions, and they stimulate hope among members. Some would refer to our 5 C's of leadership. These are somewhat universal truths about effective leadership. An effective leader is credible, has an compelling vision, is a charismatic communicator, has contagious enthusiasm, and has the ability to build culture within the organization. This slide offers some insight into how a leader might empower. They lead by example. They participate in decision making, they offer coaching, they inform, and they show concern. Spend some time examining the dimension of an empowered leader as well as the description associated with that. Some other key components about leadership are what I would like to call our cascading effects of leadership. A transformational leader serves as a role model and stimulates others to be effective leaders in return. Ultimately, good leadership cascades, rolls down like a waterfall to subordinates. Leadership can improve an organization. It can do so in 3 ways: from transformation, steady state, or evolutionary. The transformational leader is one charging in from the outside with a great discontent for the status quo, little patience for those who support it, and who turns the place inside out. There's a transformation. The steady state leader is usually an insider who knows how things are done in the organization and regroups and rebuilds the organization after the upheaval of the transformation process. And there's also the evolutionary leader. This is the one who also may be from within the organization and is not content with the steady state and focuses on steady improvement in organizational performance. So what is the difference between leadership and management? Leaders are concerned with setting the organization's future course, having a new vision, and convincing members of the necessity to change and motivate them to achieve it. Management is often concerned with breaking down that vision into operational goals. They're devoted to structuring and staffing, monitoring, and controlling. Both are incredibly important in the success of an organization. We need leaders and we need managers. The multidimensional model of leadership shown here is an attempt to synthesize and reconcile some existing theories on leadership. There are 3 states of leader behavior: required, preferred, and actual. And there are ultimately then 3 variables that determine the leader's behavior. That's those situational characteristics, our member characteristics, as well as our leader characteristics. Notice our transformational leader will work towards those variables as well as leader behavior, and ultimately work towards member satisfaction and group performance. Recall in our previous slide that our multidimensional model of leadership shows that, or states that, 3 variables determine our leader behavior. This is a consideration of our first. It's the situational characteristics influencing our required leader behavior. This is noted also in Exhibit 12.6 of your text and helps us understand those things organizationally, structurally, task-oriented that require leader behavior. Think back again to that multidimensional model of leadership. We talked just previously about the required state of leader behavior as well as that situational characteristics. Here we're going to discuss those preferred leader behavior states and the actual leader behavior states. Preferred leader behaviors is preferences for specific leader behaviors that stem from situational characteristics and the characteristics of the organization's members themselves. The influence on actual leader behavior is what actually goes on. It's the demands and constraints imposed by a situation, preferences of the members under the leader's charge, and the leader's own personal characteristics. It's the required, it's what is preferred, and it's what actually happens. With all of these things in mind regarding our multidimensional model, we have to make sure that we discuss the ability of our leader. The ability has to have the capacity to conceptualize the organization as a whole, analyze the complexities of a problem, and persuade subordinates to take a particular approach. Without these abilities, an individual will be unable to lead in specific situations. We have found ourselves at the end of Module 6. Use these questions for review to check your knowledge on the materials.